Ryan Holt, welcome to Suit Up the Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Terrence. It's a pleasure to be here.
I feel like we've been chatting on Instagram for well over a year at this point. I remember when it was like Bond 26 wish list, and here you are. You're on the show.
Well, what you floored me with that comment. Nobody remembers that my account was ever called Bond 26 Wishlist. I had like a micro number of subscribers. So that warms my heart that somebody remembers because I was cleaning up my Instagram account the other day and I was like going back in the old po posts to archive it. But yes, we've been chatting for a long time on Instagram, so it's a pleasure to finally get to converse face to face, albeit digitally.
hmm For the audience at home, would you mind just giving a brief character introduction? Who is Ryan Holt and what is Analyze This Mr. Bond?
Analyze This, Mr. Bond is my social media project, so to speak. I would describe myself as the Fraser Crane of the Bond community.
I love this. Ryan, you are now one of my favorite members of the Bond community that you would use that as your comparison. Massive fan of Frasier. Hats off to you.
Oh, well, he's my spirit animal. So I have watched Frasier all 11 seasons all the way through more times than I am comfortably saying on this podcast. But um I I my background was as a film critic. I did a lot of work as a film critic. I did a lot of film writing on the Bond films that nobody ever read. And when I started to see how active the Bond community was coming to be on social media, I figured I should dust some of that stuff off and put it out in a format where people can digest it. And luckily, people seem to enjoy that, and things have kept growing from there. So that's the core root of what I do on Instagram. It's a critical analysis with a little bit of lifestyle accoutrement stuff on
hmm
the side. I love food. I love clothes. I love, you know, uh, booze. So there's cocktails stuff I'll do online. But generally, it comes back to the core of just digging into the thematic underpinnings of James Bond and the context of that phenomenon.
It's always enjoyable. I love your YouTube channel. You won the Golden Bullet, if I recall correctly, this last year for Newcomer of the Year, and you just crossed 10,000
Yeah,
followers. Congratulations.
thank you. Up to 12,000 as of the
Wow.
past few days. So things have really taken off there. Yes, and I did win the Golden Bullet Award, which came as an astonishing surprise to me. Um, it's been a lot of really great validation. I really honestly just started this whole thing to just make some friends on the internet. I was going through a life transition and I had moved and there didn't have a strong social circle, so I was just looking to build some community and it's I've gotten so many friends like yourself that it's been more than worth the effort. It's been a real joy.
This is the good part of social media. Thank you for being a part of how the internet doesn't always suck. Which, to that point, I thought that I was one of the lone voices on the internet that said The Shadow is a fun movie and people should watch it. And when I did a post on it, you were like, "Oh, I adore this movie." And I'm like, "Ryan, we have to do a podcast."
I I am shocked that people don't like this movie. I think this movie is an absolute blast. I'm sure we'll get into it. There are things that can be said about the movie, but maybe I'm biased. I've just always had a love for the character of the Shadow. I was homeschooled as a kid, so I had a pretty unique upbringing, and one of the things that I had lying around that I could listen to for entertainment was cassette tapes of the old original radio show with Orson Welles
Did
that
your family buy them at Cracker Barrel too?
yeah, exactly. That you know exactly. Oh my goodness. I mean, that thing, I treasured that. I loved this character. I loved the iconography of this character. So
hmm
maybe I'm a little biased in the same way that I would be more biased to say getting a lot of fun out of the man with the golden gun than your average Joe Blow off the street. If I put my quote unquote objective critical hat on, I still think The
hmm
Shadow is a pretty good time at the movies.
When was the first time you saw this movie?
I really have to think back. It would have been a blockbuster rental for my family sometime in the very early 2000s by the time I finally got
Okay.
into it.
Ye-
Being I was raised it wasn't I wasn't allowed to see a lot of the things that I was very interested in when I was young. So it took me a while to circle up to the shadow by the time I finally got to see it.
Totally understand. As a former homeschooler too, I appreciate that sentiment and understand it. This movie, similar to your story, my family had gotten those not VHS, the cassette tapes of The
Mhm.
Shadow from Cracker Barrel, and I loved it. I thought, like, wow, this is like little kid T was like, this is better than Batman. Like, this is just amazing. The character, the scope. I love old time radio's like structure, so I just love the way that worked. It took like into my teens to discover that there was a film. And I am proud to say I own a Blu-ray copy, which costs far more than most Blu-rays should for this level of not box deluxe. But this film is ripe for like a Criterion Collection edition because oh my goodness, this film is so uniquely good. Like in a way, we've watched a lot of for this like little series we're doing. We're watching The Rocketeer, The Phantom, stuff like that, which have varying levels of quality and issues of their own. But I feel like The Shadow, genuinely as a movie, I have notes, but it's like just a good film. Like they took what worked and went, okay, we're going to do the Shadow version of that.
Absolutely. I'm right there with you. I think of the set of, let's say, like the when Bat Tim Burton's Batman came
Hmm.
out, it kicked off a frantic rush to find similar properties that resulted in films like The Phantom. I think The Shadow is the one that really stands up well against Tim Burton's
Hmm.
Batman in terms of scope and visual design and
Hmm.
texture and feeling. It's such a
The
gorgeous,
production quality.
yes, yes. It's just a gorgeous, fully realized embodiment of that sort of pulpy milieu on screen.
Hmm.
Something I get. I enjoy The Phantom too. I think it's a passively fun time, but it does not have the cinematic richness
Yes.
that something like this has when you watch it, and it's so lovingly designed. The
Hmm.
spectacle and scale is there. Um, One of the things that comes from the radio show that The Shadow had a very complicated history.
Very complicated.
Character. Yes, but one of the things that the radio show had really introduced was this idea that the character had a kind of quasi-psychic ability. He had the ability to do
Hmm.
tricks of the mind. And this film has a lot of fun playing with the visual possibilities
Hmm.
of that in a way that I really enjoy and helps distinguish the character from, say, just a standard vigilante like Batman, who has no superpowers to speak of.
That's one of the things that struck me in this rewatch is that I haven't seen The Invisible Man, but I recently listened to a podcast on it.
Mm.
And Russell Mulcahy did horror films, like low budget Australian horror movies. And I see a bit of that influence where I wonder if he saw The Invisible Man and was like, oh, some of these types of like ideas of what does it mean for a man not to be seen, I want to play with that visual imagery. And again, I think that the production design itself is fun in every scene. It stands right there with Tim Burton's Batman for visual beauty. Like dark and gritty can look so bland, so boring, so washed out. Godzilla, King of Monsters.
Mhm.
But this film manages to make it look like a comic book panel.
It really does. I think I'm again bias probably comes out a little bit, but I think Art Deco is one of the
Mm.
most profoundly beautiful movements in architecture, and seeing movies that just push that to the extreme, like Tim Burton's Batman, that's a little bit grungier than
Hmm.
The Shadow does. The Shadow leans a little bit more into the fantastic glamour of
Hmm.
that aesthetic.
Oh, the
Um,
Cobalt Club. When
oh yeah.
I think of what should a slick nightclub look like, I think of the Cobalt Club. I'm like, why is this still not a thing where we get dressed in our nice finery and go and just have a pleasant dinner with someone serenading us?
Uh, Look, I'll pay the premium for it. It would be so fun to have that experience again. It's that kind of Club Obi-Wan from the start of Temple of
Yes.
Doom feeling, which again,
Hmm.
also Indiana Jones fan, love in particular Temple of Doom. It's my favorite
I've
of the
got
Indiana.
earmarked for another episode to do with you in the future. Don't worry.
Oh, fantastic! Because I will talk at length about that movie. But I think that's such a perfect
Hmm.
setting for cinema to really lean into the production design. And the production designer on this film was the same person behind Terminator 2. So they were
Oh.
really moving for that
Hmm.
high caliber production level, trying to compete with something like Batman 1989. Because they even hired the same costume designer, Bob
Hmm.
Ringwood, who did the Batman suits to kind of come in here and guide their look for the shadows. So you feel them kind of really putting their best foot forward
Jerry
to say,
Goldsmith.
yeah, and Jerry Goldsmith delivering an absolute banger of a score with this one. It really, I am a person who first and foremost, when I watch a movie, I just love texture more so
Hmm.
than just narrative and character. I think film
Hmm.
is especially is primarily a visual medium, and on this, it's on all cylinders. We could I could beat this horse stone dead just by talking about it. It's just really objectively stunning to look at. The Hall of Mirrors climax,
Hmm.
and the Hall of Mirrors climax wasn't even what they intended for this movie to have. They were interrupted by an earthquake and had to like truncate their entire vision for it. And even what we have is really striking.
Hmm.
I I don't know. I can't say enough good things about the visual textures of this movie.
There's the scene where, again, part of what I like about the way the script works is it layers in like all of the shadow mythology. As someone who has, like, I haven't dived fully into the pulps because there's a lot there, and it's not all very well written, in complete fairness. In fact, most of it's garbage, but it's got lots of great, like, strong visual ideas, which is how a lot of the pulps existed. Was they give very stark characters, very definite ideas, and that's why we have heroes like the Shadow who have managed to like somehow continue into the consciousness this far. But the scene where he goes to the Shadow's sanctum and you just see this elaborate sequence of he presses the button and you see the weights and measures move to open and lower the stairs into his thing. He presses buttons and this old time like radio TV opens up and you learn that the Shadow has this intricate network of people working for him. Like again, it's stuff that pulls from the pulps, but also pulls from the radio show, and it just looks visually stunning. And Alec Baldwin as the Shadow, apparently, David Kep, who wrote the script, he wrote it with Alec Baldwin in mind because he was like, I see him playing Cranston perfectly.
Alec Baldwin is an interesting choice. First off, because he was one of the lead contenders for Batman. So again,
Hmm.
you get that like Batman versus the Shadow head to head vibe. But he has this very interesting presence because he's very aloof in a lot of
Hmm.
this film. He's a character who is emotionally cut off from himself in some ways as a human being in this. So there's a level of detachment, and Alec Baldwin is generally good at playing characters who are not, let us say, emotionally in touch with themselves. And
It's
he
past
also
7. Why aren't you wearing a tuxedo? I'm not a farmer.
exactly, exactly. But he has something that's very unique, and the movie, I will say, does not exploit this to the fullest extent, but he
Hmm.
has this trait that I really find appealing in this role. Because the Shadow is in all of its incarnations, but here in particular with the new backstory they give him, that has this really dark, dangerous.
Hmm.
And there is something that is a sort of like mad intensity behind
Hmm.
Alec Baldwin's eyes, and he has to do a lot of eye acting, quote unquote, in this movie. So it's very effective casting, and he looks perfectly elegant too as Lamont
Hmm.
Cranston in the again like Art Deco milieu of this movie. He looks perfectly at home in those situations, more so than somebody like, Michael Keaton did as
Yeah.
Batman. Like Lamont Cranston's in this movie, as played by Alec Baldwin, feels more like my traditional image of even what Bruce Wayne would have been like, because the
Hmm.
Shadow obviously being the prototype for who Batman would be as a character. Alec Baldwin plays all those facets really well. And
His
yeah,
voice even does a good job of I know my favorite version of Batman is Kevin Conroy, who does the
yeah,
very his voice is just kind of normal, and then he becomes Batman and he lowers his register, which wasn't really a thing until he did it. Anytime you
right.
see Adam West play Batman and Bruce Wayne, he's got the same voice. But in this, he does a good job of just being joie de vivre, Lamont Cranston, wealthy young man about town. Favorite line. As a small boy, hearing that line, I was like, that is what I want to be when I grow up. And but then when he comes to Shadow, his voice just drops the register, his intensity. It's that scene in Christian Bale's portrayal of Batman where no, in Ben Affleck. There's one scene, favorite scene in Batman v Superman, where you see him like party, ha ha ha, and then the moment someone turns his face just immediately becomes Batman. And Alec Baldwin's doing that in every other scene in this film where he has to switch the roles. You see there's a clear delineation between who he is in one versus the other.
Yes, absolutely. I admire that aspect of the Batman character in the same way that you do Kevin Conroy, the GOAT. Um, and here, Alec Baldwin has a naturally raspy voice, so when
Hmm.
it skews into this sort of menacing register that he is going for,
Hmm.
it works shockingly well. And if all you're familiar with is Alec Baldwin from, like post 30 Rock, Alec Baldwin, that might not seem quite right. But Alec Baldwin in the early part of his career was playing a lot of darker
Gary Glenn
characters.
Ross.
Yes. Yeah, the intensity of that is like just a ferocious performer at the best of times. What's there's a cop movie he plays. I think it's Miami Blues. If I get that
Hmm.
name wrong off the top of my head. But where he's again playing this guy on the edge. That energy works so well for this character because they've created a new backstory for the
Hmm.
Shadow for this movie that was unique, that grounds the character in an almost kind of like proto version of what they do with Batman and Batman Begins a little
I
bit.
was
That's where
thinking the
it's at
same
now.
thing this
Yeah,
morning.
yeah, like this character goes off to the comes essentially originates from the mystical East, right? And
Hmm.
here this is a character who has a background as like a warlord and
Hmm.
opium dealer and is just kind of like a monster. And this is his like redemption crusade to come back to the city and protect it. Sounds a lot like Batman Begins. And it felt when I remember seeing the trailer for Batman Begins come out and be like, huh, it seems like this is a little bit like The Shadow. And they do that version of it here, but here it's a little bit more whimsical because there's a lot
Hmm.
more of that mysticism by way of 1990s Hollywood filtered into the mix that I find endearingly odd, I would say, in the way that they approach that material.
I was reminded in the rewatch that they fit so much into this movie. So just basic overview of the plot for people at home that haven't seen it. Basically, we get the introduction of the Shadow. He's a warlord. He's kidnapped by well-meaning monks, essentially. They want to redeem his soul because they think that there's still something good in him. And then he returns to America, to New York City. He's going to change things. He becomes the Shadow. And then everything kind of goes topsy-turvy when Szechuan Khan, the last descendant of Genghis Khan, shows up. And I adore the fact that in reading like production history, David Koepp was like, Szechuan Khan is a character from the Shadow Pulps. They're like, he's perfect because he wants one definitive thing to take over the world. That's all you need as like a bad guy's motivation in this case. And it's refreshingly straightforward in an age where our villains I know we want to give them complexity, but at the same time, I miss having just the straightforward bad guy. He's the bad guy for the bad guy's sake to make the plot move. And there's an atom bomb, there's some chasing. This film incorporates some slapstick humor, some pulpy fun. It manages to have a lot of miniature scenes staggered where we see Lamont Cranston as the Shadow, but then we also see him investigate as Lamont, which I think is an important for the film. Like they packed at least what feels like two movies worth of stuff in one movie now.
100%. I mean, it's interesting in the ways that this is both simple and a complicated movie because structurally it is what you just said. It's like good guy versus super bad guy. The good guy has some complexity going on. He's got some things he has to work through, but his conflict against the bad guy couldn't be more black and white. Bad guy
Yes.
wants to take over the world, good guy wants to stop him. Which, by the way, I share your affection for that. I think in general today's blockbusters consistently skew far overcomplicated, whereas the simplicity of the structure allows so much more space for the room to breathe and then fit in
Hmm.
all this other stuff we're talking about because there is just so much texturally going
Hmm.
on in here. We aren't even talking about Margot Lane, his love interest, played by
Okay.
Penelope Miller.
I was going to ask, how did you feel about Margot Lane? Because again, for people at home, Margot Lane is an original creation for the radio program. She
Yeah.
was not a part of the original lore. She was folded in afterwards because she was so wildly popular. How do you feel about Margot Lane's portrayal in this film? Because it is still a little different than her just being the his girl Friday, essentially, of the movie.
I'm not entirely crazy about what they do with her character. I think if this movie had had, let's say, a sequel, it would have had some really weird things to follow up on with the dynamic that is established here. I think they get away with it because it's like in current terms, it's a one and done movie. We don't have like a legacy sequel where we have to kind of deal with the implications of her having her own like levels of psychic sensitivity, which is a controversial uh,
Yes.
element for fans of the Shadow. Not that the lore of the Shadow was ever established, but there are fans of the Shadow who nevertheless want to be dogmatic about what a version of the Shadow does and doesn't do. But I do like in general Penelope Ann Miller
Hmm.
as an actress. I do like her in the context of the story. She has the right um, balance of earnestness for
Hmm.
this material. I would have loved a version of it that was a little bit more lived in. This is kind of this version of the Shadow isn't really like a full origin story, but it's still
Yeah.
playing with a lot of setup pieces. So
Hmm.
the version of Margot and Lamont Cranston that I really loved from the radio show was like a kind of well-worn, established partnership, and you don't really get a sense for that sort of working relationship here. I think ideally it would be a little bit more like for me a little bit more like I don't know something like the Thin Man by the time you get
Yes.
to subsequent versions of this story. But I like the casting and um I don't find her detrimental. I just think her like subplot tends to distract more than
Yes.
it bolsters the core narrative. It just feels like a weird unresolved detour that they probably had
Hmm.
bigger plans for at one point in time.
Hmm. There's a handful of times in this film I wonder what the original plan had been because there are early moments in the film, to their credit, they set up and pay off. But there are moments earlier in the film in a couple of scenes. Specifically, I'm thinking of the colorblind scene where he's like, "Oh, am I wearing a red coat or a red or a green coat? Ooh, will that be important later?" It feels like we're very much, oh, they came up with, they're writing the end, we need to have something here that sets up this conflict we've suddenly come up with on the fly. Let's go back 20 pages and add that in.
Yeah, it does feel like that a little bit. And this movie had as far as I understand it, a fairly tumultuous script development history. I'm not really familiar with the different versions that had come up to its fruition. Sam Raimi did one of them that became the movie Darkman. So I'm sure there were a number of ideas flying around, and I want to say that's a pretty standard problem for all the blockbusters of
It's
this era.
true.
Almost of all of them. I think a lot of people tend to give even Batman 1989 a bit of a pass on that point, just because it's become so iconic. But if you really like
Hmm. It's
take
like
a good look at
Indiana
that.
Jones. If you really, that's the, I think part of actually a comment on this that I feel. Watching this, I was reminded this film does things that Indiana Jones does, and I give Indiana Jones a pass because it's a classic. Whereas this film, as much as I like it, I'm like, oh, why did they make that decision? Like, that's cheesy. But because it doesn't have the same nostalgia or the same brand presence.
Yeah, it doesn't have the same brand presence. It also, I mean, as lovely as this film is, it's also not directed by Steven Spielberg at the height of
Yes.
his powers, right? So it has some issues with like the way Steven Spielberg might have directed some of the same scenes might have been
Hmm.
even more captivating. Like Temple of Doom, again, my favorite Indiana Jones movie, has some really wild, like tonal whiplash in that movie, but it still feels like every scene in that movie is so like go for broke that it kind of clicks. In this, I'm not I'm not always sure that the subplots about Cranston dealing with his like inner darkness and the
Hmm.
way this informs his romance with this version of Margot Lane ever gets that level of full-bodied
Hmm.
expression
Hmm.
in either the script or in the direction. I think there are pieces of it where it's kind of mildly diverting, but and like, oh, those are kind of cool, spooky visual effects, but it doesn't really uh, land with a good like punchline in the way that a lot
Hmm.
of the detours in the Indiana Jones movies kind of always lead somewhere interesting.
I will say I love the scene where so he's dreamt that he's like ripped off his face,
Oh
which is
yeah.
absolutely terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Again, horror film director clearly is doing this. And then he next morning he talks to Margot. Margot is lying there in her negligee. And I'm like, this film at least does do an interesting job of like I recognize it's the delicate balance of not going overboard with the steamy or the sexual in a film that you want broader audiences to see is a thing. And this, I think this film straddles that better than a lot of others do. But she's lying there just like, oh, I dreamt that the water was lapping at my naked body. And she's like, what did you dream? And he's like, well, I dreamt that I ripped my face off and there was another man underneath. And he delivers that line so beautifully. And she's like, you need therapy. He's like, don't I know?
I see that like just you describing that should be the pitch for people watching this movie. Like that's a scene in this movie, and it is objectively amazing that it exists. And I think that sort of weird cocktail of menace, like horror film menace and sensuality and desire and humor was something that in particular, this era of the early 90s
Hmm.
filmmaking really excelled at. There was a lot of blackly comic horror tinged stuff in this, and I think too of some of the weirder moments in like Batman Forever, to jump
Hmm.
ahead a little bit
Oh,
between Batman and
yes.
Chase Meridian, that I kind of miss it because it feels so unsanitized compared to
Yes.
like the very
Hmm.
uh like calculated
Yes.
uh quote unquote product that we would have now in a
Hmm.
Marvel movie. Like a Marvel movie would never get as just like
Hmm.
weird in this way, and but the weirdness is what makes it so memorable. And this movie has a lot of those slightly like rough edges in a way that keeps it interesting as you're kind of going through it, even as it's doing like a pretty familiar superhero film structure of like super powered bad guy versus super powered good guy. Like there's just so much like
Hmm.
wonderful color along the way, like this hilarious sequence. Yeah, I honestly I just kind of like tend to black out the fact that he rips off his own face in this movie. because it's just so strange that I think about all the other stuff about it. So it's an amazing moment.
This film maintains a level of narrative and visual momentum from the start. And I think that that's one of its main selling points for me. The we eventually, when they get to disarming the bomb and the bomb is like comedically rolling away, it feels like something from the pulps. So often at this point, revisiting the film, I've read a lot more of these paperbacks from the 50s and 60s, or even a handful of the OG pulps. And so I have a greater appreciation for, oh, this is what some of these storytelling tips, tricks, methods that they would use. And seeing those echoes done in a slick Hollywood production well was really enjoyable. I'm like, ah, I see what you did there.
Yeah, I have not, unlike you, I have not gone back and read a lot of this particular style of early pulp. My pulp experience is more in the like hard-boiled noir
Hmm.
catalog, so to speak, and I've spent too much time there, I would say. But
Not such a
uh,
thing. No such thing as too much time in the hard-boiled pulps. Until you start putting on a fedora, holding a cigarette, and go, them's the brakes touch. As long as you haven't gotten that far, you're still okay.
I'm almost there. I'm almost there. But I would say I have spent a lot of time with, let's say, some of the earlier like pulp cinema of this
Hmm.
period, the early sound cinema, silent cinema, and the way that they indulged in a lot of this. And I do think you see a lot of this same kind of texture there, these same kind of
Hmm.
visual moments, the same kind of even action beats. Something like The Big Bomb is something that would read very well in a silent film. A lot of these
Hmm.
sequences do have that kind of um, silent film energy in some ways, which is appropriate given the time period and all that too. But it just genuinely feels like such a deep love letter to the
Hmm.
period of its time in a way that I think, and you've already brought this up, Indiana Jones kind of also feels very much like a love letter to
Hmm.
these textures. That I think The Shadow is a safe recommendation for anybody who really gets into Indiana Jones in the same, like it has that
Hmm.
same mystical artifact texture. The villain
Hmm.
is he emerges from a giant silver coffin that like is
Okay. The other favorite line is when he emerges from the silver coffin. He stands there. He literally takes off this mask, and there's a security guard holding a gun up and goes, "We're closed."
that's like I don't know how that kind of humor hits with, let's say, Gen Z. I don't know, but I'm really nostalgic for that kind of like 1990s blockbuster writing at this point because I'm so tired of like the smug snark that kind of like set in. Sorry, I like let's say that Joss Whedon infected
Hmm.
all of media with. There's something so like earnestly goofy
Hmm.
about that moment that is beautiful. And I also want to say John Lone in that role is really great. He's a great actor at the best of times. And he's having a lot of fun being such a wonderfully hammy villain here. Um, and I think to your point about villains being simplistic is I think when they're simplistic, it adds actually in some ways sometimes more room for
Hmm.
an actor of a certain type to kind of step in and just do what they want with it because the
Hmm.
shackles off. And I think he does well here, and I think he has a really interesting charisma with Alec Baldwin. How do you feel about Lone's performance here?
He's So we recently did a watch of The Rocketeer, and Timothy Dalton plays the villain, and Timothy Dalton just chews all the scenery. He is
Oh yeah.
charismatic. I think he's better as the villain in that film than as James Bond in
Oh
Living
wow.
Daylights. Like he's so good, but it's because the villain is very specifically this kind of note, and he just plays it well, and he brings his charisma to it. I think John Lone does the same thing here, where he's just he knows what he's there to do, and he's savoring it. The whole the exchange about the ties. He's like, "Oh, that is a lovely tie. Where did you get it from? Brooks Brothers. The one in Midtown? Yes. You're a psychopath." Like just again, and then they sit down at that table in like the Chinese restaurant and they're both wearing like matching suits and ties. He's like, "Nice tie." They're just like back and forth. Genuinely, that's one of the things I miss about, I think you referenced Golden Gun before. I think that Roger Moore and Christopher Lee have a similar vibe where when the villain and the hero, especially when you have what I'll call sophisticated villains and heroes. I read a book called The Bond Odyssey, written
Oh
by
yeah,
Adam
yes,
Muckle.
Muckle.
Wonderful book. I absolutely loved it. One of the things I thought he did a great job pointing out is that the whole concept of xenia, of the sharing of a meal and the hospitality, is a recurrent feature in the Bond books. And I think it's one of the things that separates it from a conventional hard-boiled detective novel is that there is that level of um, for lack of a better term, civilized discourse between the villain and the hero. And I think
Yeah,
that here in The Shadow, we are seeing a similar thing where Szechuan Khan is trying to lure Alec Baldwin with his past, with his he's like, you enjoyed the war, you enjoyed being powerful in this way. I will make you my right hand. Together we shall rule. And it has this kind of like Star Wars-ish feel on that.
sure.
But that is done in such a wonderful way because the two characters are sitting down over Chinese food as they're having this discussion about, of course I'm going to defeat you. Of course you'll try to stop me. And that just in my mind it always has raised the bar on you're not just a bad guy. Like it's not something that even though he's a one-note villain in the sense of what his goal is, it's take over the world. Very easy, but the fact that the way he goes about it is suave, sophisticated. He has a plan, and that his character is that he is going to do these things. And that's where I think the actions of characters help flesh out when you're not going to, from just a writing perspective, the actions of characters flesh out more about who they are when you're not going to tell more about who they are.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I
Oh,
went down that full rabbit trail.
well, I'm delighted you did because I if anything, I think one of my favorite tropes in movies overall is if I really think about all the let's say just strip broadly canon of pulp storytelling, what I really love is I just always love scenes where it's people in a conflict having a civilized dinner together.
Yes.
You can look at so many different versions of it. You can look at we're talking about like the very fantastical ones. You could look at a scene like in Heat where it's
Yes.
De Niro and Pacino against each other. And and what's lovely about it is that it sets up this dynamic of like even if there's loathing, there's kind of like a begrudging respect between the parties that really accentuates the conflict in a really nice way. I think you could think of like the moment in the film Goldfinger where Connery is
Hmm.
just so impressed when Goldfinger explains his plan and Bond's like, "Oh, oh, okay, you got one. It's a good plan. That's a good plan. I don't know how I'm gonna find my way to sabotage that. That's really good." That that wonderful sort of
It's game recognizing game.
it's game recognizing game, and it's almost like in another life these people would be friends instead of enemies. Like in some reincarnated past, like these people were like on the same side at one point. And you know, I it's the same energy you get with like Christopher Lee and
Hmm.
Roger Moore, where they really feel like uh, they just kind of like match each other's energy. In the same way here, uh, it's a lovely blend between hero and villain here. And I also I do love as a sartorial guy any shout outs to ties and clothing as a way to do it. So like foregrounding their relationship around discussion of a tie a little bit is always a sweet spot for me.
One other just sartorial comment, related to clothes. When Margot is like, "Oh, I don't. All these clothes are wrinkled. Do you have anything?" He's like, well, and then he opens the closet and it's just a whole bunch of women's clothes. He's like, this belonged to my Aunt Rose. Wow, she kept her figure, didn't she? Just again, this film does a good job with having a range of excellent lines, and that's the one chemistry I feel like never quite clicks for me is Margot and Alec Baldwin. It,
Yeah.
it's something where, and it's hard to pin down because I feel like this happens with multiple of these like pulp era type. I would say pulp era. The like Rocketeer, Phantom, Shadow. I feel like that is like a click that doesn't quite fit in most of these for me, where the two romantic pairings don't quite have A level chemistry for me. But that's my read on the film. It's serviceable. It's fine. It's just the one thing that I feel like if this was there, it would be on the level of Raiders for me in some ways.
Oh wow.
Like it just,
That's some high praise.
but that's because I really do feel like that level of chemistry between that Nick and Nora energy is, I
Yeah.
think, the thing that I have found growing up. It's the thing I love writing. It's the thing I love seeing on screen. When you have even Suits is obviously a favorite show of mine. Harvey and Donna, like when you have characters, these male female dynamics that they just crackle with energy, that elevates a story for me in a way that not a lot of other things do. And I think Marion Ravenwood and Indiana Jones really do a good job of having that kind of vibe.
Sure. And I do agree with you that I don't I'm kind of maybe I've just seen too many 90s blockbusters at this point that I've kind of like numb to the fact that the romantic side of them rarely works. Every once in a while you get something where there's a little bit of a spark, but generally it seemed like Hollywood at this point in time was really bad at casting um a lead and their romantic partner.
Hmm.
And it is, yeah, it's kind of it's a weird energy them together. They're not two actors in general, just to take them outside of this movie
Hmm.
that I would be like, oh yeah, Alec Baldwin and Penelope Ann Miller, those are the two that they're gonna light the screen on fire. You can kind of see why they would be cast in isolation
Hmm.
for the roles, but you would kind of envision them with a different partner.
Hmm.
In some ways. But yeah, I would say we've kind of hit on that a whole point. Like that relationship is kind of like the weak point of
Hmm.
this movie on the whole. It's one of those cases where the hero has more chemistry with the villain than he does with his love interest, which again is often
Also
true.
happens in The Man with the Golden Gun.
It does. It's very much so, very much so. It's one of those things where I can roll with it because if the other pieces
Hmm.
are strong, I
Yeah.
can kind of keep going with it. And also, this is a movie that moves. Like
Hmm. It
it,
clicks.
it clicks. It doesn't have today's blockbuster symptom of being like 2 hours and 45 minutes, and you have to have really like put up with a lot to get to the end of it. All this stuff is happening in fairly abbreviated shorthand for
Hmm.
communicating these relationships. Everything, even the most weird of these detours, still has to be relatively efficient in the
Hmm.
runtime that it has. So I'm willing to forgive like a slightly awkward romance as long as it's not like wasting my time uh dwelling on it. And this movie certainly doesn't. It's always moving on to the next like
Hmm.
exciting little diverting beat,
Hmm.
which again is something like very similar to the Indiana Jones rhythm of just kind of like every every few minutes you just kind of need something new and striking to grab attention and kind of propel stuff forward.
Hmm. On that, how we have we not talked about Tim Curry yet? Tim Curry is in this movie playing a bad guy who is an absolute lunatic towards the end. And I just remember going, wait, this is Tim Curry, the guy from Home Alone, Lost in New York, playing an absolute, just, he looks plastic at a certain point because his weird smile is just too crazy to be contained.
Tim Curry is one of those actors where if you cast him, he can just do no wrong for me. Like he is. he is an actor who gives new meaning to the word ham, like in the best way possible. Like it is just like he sinks his teeth into whatever he's doing. And I was preparing for this podcast, reading about the history of the Shadow, and like one of the things he said he was excited to do about this role was that it just let him foam at the mouth. It was his like quote unquote words. And I have to say, like, yeah, you delivered, Tim. Like
He earned
this
his paycheck.
yeah, it is quite quite an out there performance. And in general, this movie has a lot of really great character actor
It
appearances.
has the Ian McKellen. Like I remember seeing this and going, "Wait, hold on," because by this point I've seen Lord of the Rings already. I'm like, rewind here. Is that who I think it is? Playing
Yeah,
the absent-minded professor character?
yeah, I pretty much bumbling mostly like comedic part in a lot of ways for good old Ian McKellen. We have Peter Boyle showing up as the cab driver ally of the Shadow.
Oh,
We have
the
James.
moment that he's repeating the lines that the shadow is giving. He's like, the ice is slippery. It just it's, again, beautiful comedic beats.
Yeah, and I feel like those little things are just speak to the kind of like levels of thoughtful touch that kind of go into a movie of this style and um like delight because so many movies are just propelled by momentum. We have to get you to the
Hmm.
next big thing. Audiences
Hmm.
don't really care about watching a minor taxi cab driver just try to like practice his like special phrase. But that's the exact kind of detail that gives you a lot of color in this.
Hmm.
It makes even these bit characters feel that much more endearing to spend time with. Yeah, that bit is so amusing, and that those touches. And I also love seeing James Hong show up in here. It's like there are so many like good, wonderful, like, oh, that guy actors in this movie, in addition to just, Alec Baldwin and Penelope Ann Miller and John Lone. It's a good cast.
Hmm. Like
I don't know.
I feel like this film had all of the ingredients to be Batman 1989, which honestly, if it did not, I don't know why it isn't on the same level. And I wonder if it's because Jack Nicholson of it all. Like if you cast a different actor than Jack Nicholson, like that level performer as the Joker, does Batman 1989 hit the same level of cultural phenomenon that it did?
I mean, that's an interesting thought. I would actually say it probably doesn't. Like I think that movie, if you take the Nicholson of it all out of it, is a kind of rickety movie. And
Hmm.
even if you cast Nicholson with somebody else who is like in the running, like let's say you know, I don't know. Like Nicholson was a force of nature in that, and it set the stage for that. And again, a lot of the movies we're talking about that in this set of like
Hmm.
the pulp resurgence were relative failures, right? The
Hmm.
Shadow wasn't big. The Phantom didn't really like take off. I guess if you really wanted to include it in this like legacy of pulp resurgence, you could talk about they finally made another Shadow. They finally made another Zorro in the Mask of
Hmm.
Zorro, in which kind of feels like loosely tied to this strand
Yeah.
of like retro vigilantes, but most of them really didn't connect, and it does feel like that was related to star quality. And even in the
Hmm.
way that they made subsequent Batman movies of this era was very different than they would do
Yeah.
now. It was like I remember going to see Batman Forever in theaters, and even at the young time, like as a young kid, like the way that title sequence just foregrounds everybody's name, where it's like Val Kilmer, Jim Carrey, and like it was like the stars are the draw. The advertising campaign was always
Hmm.
about like, look, it's Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face. You know you want to show up for this. And it does feel like this movie just lacked the like, oh, we got this person
Hmm.
to put their stamp on this. Alec Baldwin obviously being respected, but like is not gonna necessarily put butts in seats for an action blockbuster of that level. If they'd gotten somebody on the tier of Nicholson to be the villain
Hmm.
or um even had their like Michelle Pfeiffer Catwoman
Yeah.
moment, maybe something would have clicked a bit more with audiences. It's hard to say. I mean, being alive at this time and media aware
Hmm.
in my relative like youth at this point. I was young, but I was aware. Like, believe me, I knew every time a new Batman movie dropped. I didn't really know
Hmm.
that The Shadow was a movie when it came out. So I really would have to go back and ask somebody who is even a little bit more aware to what extent this movie was aggressively promoted by the studio because it kind of felt like a kind of blip as opposed to like a behemoth would-be blockbuster in my memory at any rate.
Hmm. Because like I'm thinking of it, in some ways this movie feels like something that would be more today in the sense
Yeah.
that we don't have if I say we don't have stars today, that I think paints a much grimmer picture of Hollywood than we have. But it's not the way that the 90s were with, I would say, the we have the literal stars in the firmament that Paramount set out with. Now you have elevated character actors in most senses. Not That's just a general across the board opinion. I know that there are some genuine stars out there. It's just there are much fewer of them. And now they make movies based on properties more than they do star power. Example, we had a Jurassic Park movie that the star was Scarlett Johansson. And this is not to say Scarlett Johansson isn't a great actress or an amazing star. It's just she's not Harrison Ford.
No, she's not. And I think it is hard for and I don't even want to say like the 90s was a shadow of what the star system was in like the heyday of Hollywood where it was, Joan
Bogard.
Crawford headlining a picture or something like that, but it was so central. I mean, this was the era where they gave Arnold Schwarzenegger a $20 million paycheck in 1997 dollars, which let me tell you went pretty far just to put on a giant like freeze suit and paint himself blue. So it was such a big propulsive part, and I remember even just the way my parents would talk about seeing movies in this era, and it
Hmm.
was so focused on, oh, this person is in the movie, we should go see it. It was
Yes.
how movies were marketed. It's how movies were financed and made. And it is a big shift from this era where if you did The Shadow as a movie today, and they feasibly could, and I hope at some point they do revisit this character because
Hmm.
this character is exciting and
I have
deserves
a
to.
question on that one, so hold on to that thought.
Okay. Um, that you would see a relatively maybe not a total unknown, but like let's just say like an Oscar Isaac type, right?
Hmm.
Who ended up playing like Moon Knight
Hmm.
for Marvel. So, you wouldn't necessarily have um you wouldn't get Tom Cruise
Yeah,
to to be in the shadow unless he was the one like who really wanted to make it. So, um, yeah, an interesting point.
I am curious. Do you think that this is in an age where we're constantly looking for IP that needs to be revitalized and just draw out anything that's been done before and do it again? Do you think that The Shadow needs to be rebooted as a film, as a mini series? And if so, do you have someone in mind that you'd like to see either lead it creatively or someone that you'd like to see lead it in terms of being the main character and star?
Oh wow. Okay, that is a big thought experiment that I haven't fully thought through. But I would say it with all these things. it's often a be careful what you wish for. I
Hmm.
have learned to be more cautious with
Hmm.
wishing for more helpings of something that I already loved than not. I think um, as anyone who grew up on the Star Wars movies and dreamt of the day that like Han Solo would again reappear and we would get this sequel trilogy that George Lucas had talked about in, like the very early days, finally got it. And there was emotional closure for me in getting it. I'm not even like
Hmm.
one of the people who was rabidly unhappy with it, but it you can't go home again
Yes.
is my point and my great feeling about all of this. And I would say that if the shadow was explored again, it is very unlikely it would be handled with the level of grandeur and kind of like
Hmm.
idiosyncratic
Yeah.
flair that this version of the shadow would have. So that said, I do think there's a lot to do with the
Hmm.
Shadow as the character. There have been some lovely excursions for the character in comic book form in recent years
Hmm.
that have really paved the way for what could be some really satisfying versions of the character rendered on screen. I think the character has a lot to offer in terms of that 1930s uniquely like
Hmm.
quasi noir, but also like adventure story energy. The Shadow kind of
Hmm.
straddles those two lanes in a way that could be really fun in the right hands. My pick for filmmaker to do it is just because it's always been a passion project of his, and it comes up every few years. Is just to go back to Sam Raimi because Sam Raimi
Hmm.
loves this character. And I think Sam Raimi is the kind of filmmaker who would be able to bring a very human, idiosyncratic touch
Hmm.
to this property instead of just uh, stripping away a lot of the oddness of it.
Hmm.
And as far as who I would cast as Lamont Cranston, I do not know. That that is tricky, but hopefully, guy, this is such a bad pick because he can't be all the characters, and he tends to get a default pick for me. But maybe like a Robert Pattinson type, just
Oh
somebody like
yeah.
all lithe,
Hmm.
would look good in a very like 1930s style dinner suit, um, and
I
has
think.
enough of a sense of humor about himself that can
Hmm.
also like kind of go back and forth. That's why he was so good as he's been very good as Batman, but he
Hmm.
could be really good in this kind of milieu as well.
I think that he definitely has the right kind of energy to that, where he is the. I think that his approach, he's like an actual actor, which I know that that's weird to have to qualify, but like he will bring a sense of I am trying to discover who this character is and what am I going to bring to it on screen. He'd bring a sense of intent to the role
Yeah.
that I think would be refreshing. And as much as I made my comment about stars before, I think that he is one of those cases of a delineation in that he is an actual actor
Yes.
in a sea of people that often play themselves, which I thoroughly enjoy in a lot of movies. But in this case, especially if they were to explore the shadow as someone who does, like, I'd love to see the costume element where he's in, because in the old pulps, the shadow would like in kind of like the way the Saint movie was with Val Kilmer, he'd put
Oh
on
yeah.
disguises, he'd like hide in places. He wouldn't just use his mind powers because they didn't have that in the pulps. So it'd be interesting to see him take that like Sherlock Holmes constantly putting on disguises to intermingle with others to gather information type thing.
Oh yeah. That would be great. Who would you cast as if it wasn't Robert Pattinson? Who would you cast? Who's your Lamont Cranston?
I'm not as up with my current actors. I've been steeped in the 90s for the last like month. So in fairness, I think that I'm trying to think of a good solid character actor. Like when we were talking about the Rocketeer, the guy that played Huey in the Boys, I think would be a great like reboot of the
Sure.
Rocketeer. He has that kind of like sincerity, et cetera, et cetera. which actually, for that reason, because I thought about the boys, I he's too old for it, but I would love to see Carl Urban just because I think that
Oh,
he has the that sense of just he can rough and tumble as the shadow and be absolutely biting, but then he cleans up really well. Like he's too old though at this point to like do it justice if they were to do it, I think. He wouldn't be cast, but he would be a fun pick as Lamont Cranston.
he, I love that idea. I mean, Carl Urban is one of those guys who can be a very intense actor, but he can also
Hmm.
just he just cuts loose and has a lot of fun. He's been great in so many genre related things because he just kind of lets fly. I could see him sinking his teeth into this material. That's a really good call.
If this was a mini series, I feel like it could be the thing for an actor that Reacher was for Alan Ritchson.
Okay, yeah.
And that's what I'd like to see, honestly. I'd like to see someone cast that is that slight. He's done some TV, he's been in the minor roles, but he hasn't gotten his thing that he makes his own. And this becomes his like Sean Connery to James Bond. Like I think
Yeah.
that's where the shadow honestly, it's kind of what Michael Keaton got with
Yeah.
Batman. And that's where I think that what's interesting about stunt casting the villains is it gives the draw while still giving the opportunity for someone else to turn this into their star vehicle.
Yeah, I think that's interesting on multiple points. And I also agree with what you kind of said about maybe like a mini series being the way to approach it. I think one of the things with these sort of stories is if you always do like a movie, it puts a lot of weight on that,
Hmm.
$200 million blockbuster experience to like have delivered something. But a lot of the time, if I think back to like the radio show and things that I really appreciate about this character is the ability to kind of have
Hmm.
fun with the framework once you do it. It's something that the reason it's a high watermark for superhero storytelling in general. Batman the animated series was able to do exceptionally
Gorgeous.
well,
Love it.
gorgeous, but also just really relaxed in terms of what it was doing on a week by
Hmm.
week basis in the sense that sometimes you got your classic superhero hijinks and
Hmm.
sometimes you just got like a nice little kind of detour
Hmm.
story, and that range could be really nice with something like The Shadow because it's playing in a similar textural area and you could have a lot of fun with that in that space. Yeah, I
Hmm.
agree. I would love to see, I think in general, when it comes to casting choices, I'm happy to throw a celebrity name out there. But I honestly, for any of my favorite characters that I've loved and cherished, just give me a really well like cast, like relative unknown or like
Hmm.
lesser known
Charlie
person.
Cox, Daredevil. Like this,
Exactly.
this honestly, I'd love to see the Daredevil treatment where it gets that kind of we're stripping it down to kind of the bare essentials and you see him build the mythology
Yeah.
while at the same token it's still delivering a weekly thoroughly satisfying story and I think that the effects are there, etc, etc. We didn't even talk about the effects in this movie. The effects in this movie are stunning. They hold up. They have a guy that's invisible and like vague shadows. This is the best like visual rendition of the shadow.
It,
I'm delighted by it.
I yeah, I can't let that pass without an amen to that. This comes from the era of one of the reasons the 90s are such a particularly good time for special effects filmmaking. It was that wonderful seamless blend of like we're experimenting with CGI, but everything's also like a little practical at the same time, which is how you got something like Jurassic Park to look as amazing as it did. And here you're getting that same wonderful balance of like makeup effects and like traditional set building and stunt work and things like that, coupled with some really lovely optical effect work and matte painting work
Hmm.
that is just really, really well done. Yeah, the effects in this really hold up. This is a spectacle that continues to deliver.
And on that note, we're going to wrap things up here. Ryan, it has been a pleasure having you on the show. I'm so delighted to talk about The Shadow and find that you also had the VHS tapes from Cracker Barrel. Where can people go to learn more about you, your work, and analyze this, Mr. Bond?
They can find me on Instagram under the name Analyze This Mr. Bond or on YouTube also under the name Analyze This Mr. Bond.
And I will link in the show notes. Thanks again for coming on the show, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me, Terrence. It has been an honest pleasure.